Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. As always, opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the Naval War College, United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. So today we're excited to be joined again by Team Krulak non-resident fellow Dr. James Holmes as part of our new focus on Russia and Ukraine. He's a professor of strategy, the inaugural holder of the J.C. Wiley Chair of Maritime Strategy, and a two-time visiting professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College. Dr. Holmes is also a prolific author with hundreds of book chapters and essays under his belt, and his book Red Star Over the Pacific, China's Rise and the Challenge to U.S. Maritime Strategy is on the Navy Professional Reading List and the U.S. Marine Corps and U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Professional Reading Lists. Finally, he is the first Brutecast guest to have a three-peat on the show, so we're again very grateful for the generous donation of his time to our series and to our community of interest. So, sir, thanks again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, Ian, thanks for the kind introduction, and it's always a pleasure to be with you all down at Marine. I just wanted to talk briefly through not so much the Black Sea, not so much the local aspects of the Russia-Ukraine situation, which are all over the news. But I wanted to talk through a little bit, just briefly, some remarks coming out of Moscow about the potential for Russia to station missiles of some type or troops in the Caribbean Sea. Specifically, potentially in Venezuela and or Cuba. And I'm less interested in whether the Russians will do that. I do think it does make some strategic sense if they think that by mounting a token deployment of forces to the Caribbean, they could actually siphon away U.S. forces from Russia's near abroad, and particularly along the Ukrainian frontier. So I think there is some logic to it. I don't know how likely it is. It may just be talk coming out of the negotiations between the United States and Russia last week. But if we posit that this might happen, we know it has happened before, back in 1962, 60 years ago. This is when the Cuban Missile Crisis took place, which a somewhat similar circumstance in which Russia placed, or the Soviet Union rather, was about to place missiles in Cuba as a response to U.S. Stationing missiles in Turkey, and of course in Russia's near abroad. So there is historical precedent for this. There's also strategic sense behind it, and therefore, why don't we just posit what happens? How might the United States respond to this? And the way I look at it personally, I always reach back to U.S. Diplomatic and military history. We actually have several potential precedents for a U.S. response to Russia mounting such a deployment in our own backyard. First of all, and they all derive from the Monroe Doctrine. I posit in my forthcoming essay, I posit four of these. Three are certainly a variant of the Monroe Doctrine. The fourth, the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, I think also falls under the loose rubric of the Monroe Doctrine, even though that doctrine dared not speak its name by the 1960s. First of all, the very first potential future I see would be a repeat of the Monroe Doctrine as originally enunciated in the 1820s by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and President James Monroe himself. The Monroe Doctrine, you can find it out there in places online like the Avalon Project up at Yale Law School and so forth. It came in two separate passages of the Monroe Doctrine, but they basically said there shall be no European return to recolonize Latin American republics that had recently won their independence through a series of revolutions in the 18-teens and into the 1820s. So basically, this is an American attempt to freeze the status quo. So the European empires they might hold what they already had in 1823 when the doctrine came out, but they were not allowed. The United States would not permit them to come back and restore the rule either directly or by proxy. Now, there's an interesting thing about the Monroe Doctrine as it was originally formulated, and that is that we had no way to enforce it. We did not have a serious Army, Marine Corps, or Navy able to basically police an entire hemisphere to prevent the French Empire or whoever from coming back to the New World, the Spaniards or whatever. But what we did have was a silent partner, just by a confluence of interest between the United States and the former mother country, Great Britain. The Royal Navy more or less acted as the guarantor, the silent guarantor of the Monroe Doctrine for most of the 19th century, thus letting the United States spread to the West Coast, undergo its revolution, its civil war, undergo its industrial age, and so forth, without actually having to enforce its own foreign policy doctrine. So you could, in a sense, you could call the Monroe Doctrine, as it originally existed, a doctrine of purpose without power. Somebody else supplied the power, and thus the United States could essentially free ride on British supplied maritime security. So that's model number one. I don't think that really has a lot of applicability today, because obviously the United States does have not only purpose but also significant military power to this day. And in fact, it's grown in the world well beyond anything that Monroe or Adams could have imagined. The Monroe Doctrine was basically a doctrine for the Western Hemisphere. So I think that one we can take that one on board. It's interesting and so forth, and it provides us a sounding board. But at the same time, it doesn't. There's very little chance that this will provide any real guidance in Washington today. Secondly, leap forward to the second model of the Monroe Doctrine. In the 1880s, this is when Congress decided, in its wisdom, to lay down America's first serious battle fleet. It was a series of big gun armored steam-driven ships. So this gives the United States some ability to enforce the Monroe Doctrine as that fleet matures. And in fact, about 15 years after that, the legislation comes down in 1883. In 1898, the United States sees fit to use that fleet to attack a rival empire, the Spanish Empire, in the Spanish-American War. Drives the Spaniards out of Cuba and Puerto Rico and places like that. And also out of the Philippine Islands, and thus spreads the United States' sway into the Eastern Hemisphere for the first time, and again makes the United States a modest colonial empire of itself. So, to me, this model of the Monroe Doctrine really culminates in 1895, not 1898. This is when the United States sees fit to try to mediate. In fact, it demands the right to mediate a dispute between Great Britain, which is still a resident power in South America, and Venezuela. As it happens, the loosely demarcated border between British Guyana and Venezuela was actually delineated. Gold and other natural resources were discovered along that frontier, and thus this became a focus of dispute between the two countries. So it looked like there might be war. The United States didn't want war in the Caribbean basin, and therefore President Grover Cleveland and his Secretary of State Richard Olney demanded the right to mediate between the two countries. In the course of the exchange of diplomatic correspondence between the United States and the British leadership under Lord Salisbury, Olney sends a note to Salisbury, and he says the United States is now practically sovereign in the Western Hemisphere, or he says on this continent, but he's referring to the Western Hemisphere, and that's a pretty striking thing to say. I mean, anybody listening to this podcast has studied a little bit of international law and international relations, and we all know that sovereignty connotes a monopoly on the use of force within certain frontiers, within certain borders that we call, within which we claim this territory. Essentially, this is state ownership. If the United States is actually claiming practical sovereignty over an entire hemisphere, that's a massive uptick in the ambitions expressed in the Monroe Doctrine. In fact, I personally call this America's Strongman Doctrine. This is a very different interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, in which the United States is essentially claiming the right to get its way on anything that it wants to get its way on in the Western Hemisphere. So I think when you think about this, I think there's a possibility. Nobody's going to refer to the Cleveland administration or Secretary Olney or anything, but I think without mentioning this precedent, this could provide guidance for the United States today. It would like to keep other rival powers out of the Caribbean, out of the Western Hemisphere, just because it can. And I think that there's a very proprietary instinct that's on display in the 1890s, and I think that's something that commends itself to our attention. Nextly, I would and thankfully, by the way, the United States only claimed sort of quasi-sovereignty for about a decade. In fact, a little bit less than a decade. If you leap ahead about 9 years into the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, he articulates something that historians call the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And the context for this is in the early 20th century, there's been a spate of debt defaults in the Caribbean Sea. Weak governments would take out loans from European banks. They would either fall or be unable or unwilling to repay their debts. And common practice when that happened was the bankers in Europe would go to their governments, ask for diplomatic intervention. If the two governments could not work things out so that the loans got repaid, the European government would send the Navy. The Navy, and what would the Navy do when it got to the Caribbean Sea? It would seize the customs facility in that country, in the defaulting country, and thus seize the customs revenue coming through that customs house. That was how governments usually derived their tax revenue back in those days, and therefore that was a good way to get the revenue back to repay the bankers back home in Europe. So, that wasn't something that President Roosevelt really worried about. He believed that countries should uphold their international obligations, but he also worried about a breach of the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine had declared all the way back to 1823 that Europeans shall not seize territory in the Americas. TR sees the potential for that to happen. The Dominican Republic is a catalyst. There was a situation in this genre in the Dominican Republic that prompted him to articulate his corollary, in which he said, "We are not going to allow Europeans to seize American territory that they might then use to build a naval base and thus station warships in America's backyard, threatening the sea lanes that would ultimately run to the Panama Canal when that opened up in 1915." So it's a very preventive doctrine. It's about using power to essentially keep Europeans at arm's length, and ultimately he believed to also help American republics get back on their feet. So he essentially, the Roosevelt Corollary, you can also find this online. It essentially says the United States reserves the right to intervene in Caribbean in Latin American affairs when a government is unwilling or unable to uphold its obligations that might lead to a seizure of American territory. So again, TR takes this very muscular doctrine and he tries to put it on more of a almost a quasi-legal foundation. He's setting a standard for U.S. intervention rather than actually reserving the right to intervene willy-nilly in Latin American affairs. So I call this the Constabulary model of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, I should point out, and this could actually be another model, but it starts getting to be a little elaborate when you start doing it. It's good to keep models of potential futures simple. But I at least should point out that after TR leaves office, his successors, Taft and ultimately Woodrow Wilson, they take the TR corollary and they run amok in Latin America. It gets to such an extent that the United States, the U.S. government, is actually forbidding Latin American countries to take out loans in European banks and requiring them to take out loans in American banks. And so, I mean, they're taking the TR corollary to the nth degree, and this grates on Latin American sensibilities to this day. If you ask somebody from Latin America about this, chances are you're going to get an earful. And I think there's some reason for that. So the TR corollary actually does make a comeback after TR's time, is misused, and ultimately is disavowed in the 1920s. And with it, the Monroe Doctrine more or less goes away as a staple of, or at least nobody talks about it so much in Washington, just because of that taint that comes out of the 19-teens and the 1920s. So anyway, the constabulary model for me is a third model that could help explain how Washington today might react to a Russian deployment in our backyard. I actually don't think that that's going to be a direct model, simply because presumably Cuba and/or Venezuela would invite Russia to come in. There would be no forcible seizure of territory. So I think that one's probably off to the side a little bit as well. And lastly, there's the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. And again, as I briefly went over what that was. We've mostly studied it in U.S. Foreign policy history and military history. Basically, this is the United States articulating a kind of reciprocity related to not the Monroe Doctrine by name, but to that proprietary instinct. Essentially, the United States is offering it. Ultimately, the John Kennedy administration agrees to remove the missiles from Turkey in response for the Soviet Union taking those ships that were carrying weapons to go to Cuba out of the Caribbean. So The Russian Navy goes home. We come home from Turkey in a nuclear sense, and that's kind of how that one is. That's kind of how that one was resolved, albeit with the real possibility of warfare, and including potentially nuclear warfare, 90 miles off the Florida coast. So again, things got very tense in 1962. So, having laid out those four models, the original Monroe Doctrine, the Free Rider Doctrine, the Constabulary Doctrine of TR, and the Strongman Doctrine of Cleveland and only, and then the TR Corollary itself, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. That provides four rough guides to potential American responses to a Russian deployment of missiles or troops today. Which ones actually potentially describe what we might do? I would say, again, I think I hinted that the Strongman, the sort of proprietary doctrine towards the Western Hemisphere, might come into play, and I think obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis precedent might come into play as well, because I think that kind of reciprocity is what Russia is hoping for today. They agree to leave our backyard to us. We agree to leave their near abroad to them to do as they see fit. So the near abroad being, in this case, I think certainly the former Soviet Union, but also the former Soviet Empire, including places like Romania and so forth, that are now NATO members. So the NATO alliance, of course, throws a little bit of a new wrinkle into this Monroe Doctrine thinking, and I think that makes the Cuban Missile Crisis a particularly rich precedent to study as we contemplate what Washington might do. So there's four potential alternative futures, four ways to gauge a potential reaction out of Washington in the coming days and months, or it's always possible that we might spin off in another direction altogether. But that too is useful guidance from looking back at U.S. diplomatic history, and that's how I see things. I look forward to the important part of our being together this morning, which is the interactions between you and me. So thanks, Ian, thanks for the platform.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Holmes. And yeah, I've got a few questions here, and then our Deputy Lieutenant Colonel Zepeda is online too. So I'll turn it over to him for any questions he's got here shortly. So first thing I had was, you highlighted a couple of possible options, but whatever option we end up picking, or if there's a fifth one that we isn't on the list yet, do you think if we offered that as something for the Russian leadership to think about, at this point, do you think that would have any impact on their decision-making framework? Would they be? Do you think they're really open to a possible option of reciprocity or something, or not?
Well, I think so. I think so. I think that's exactly what they want out of this situation. I think that's why they've been so vocal and so saber rattling and all this kind of thing that we've seen in the last weeks and months. I think that's. They tell us that that's what they want. In fact, they are more or less demanding a rollback of NATO deployments from the near abroad. I think they want us to roll back to basically to our posture in 1997. So prior to NATO engagement and enlargement, as we called it back in the 1990s, when NATO was doing that expansion process. And there's actually a rich debate to be had. In fact, it is being had about the wisdom of NATO enlargement, both back then, but also today. It's the alliances, at least I think it was 2004 or thereabouts, at least in principle, agreed that Ukraine would become part of NATO, and that seems to be what has gotten the attentions of Putin and his advisors in Moscow. They don't want that. They would like to resume that sphere of influence. I don't know what to make of claims that Putin actually wants to formally reconstruct the Soviet Union, but he certainly wants to be the dominant player within the former Soviet sphere, and I think that's what they're looking for. So I don't see any compelling reasons for the Russians to be in the Caribbean Sea. That probably looks like kind of an easy trade-off for them if they can get NATO to retreat from Russian borders. And of course, if Ukraine did become part of NATO, that does bring NATO to Russia's frontiers, and that's something that's very hard to tolerate for any big power. I think, and by the way, I think there's an East Asian analog to this, and that would be North Korea. China's very loath to see Korea unify, simply because potentially, if that was under Southern rule, that could potentially bring U.S. forces to Russian and Chinese frontiers in the Far East. So the big powers just don't like having adversaries right on their borders. And I think it's really not much more complicated than that. So my guess would be that they would be receptive to such a modus vivendi, such an arrangement, whatever you want to call it.
Oh yeah, so that actually dives into one of the other ones I had here, which was, that whole concept of having sort of the say in your near abroad. Realizing Ukraine joining NATO, that odds probably very low at a minimum, in the here and now. But there's also all those other countries who are in NATO that, as you just said, Russia's looking to have them essentially roll back. So how those other countries, how do we square that request from Russia, with whatever the logic or behind it that they're addressing in terms of how we would respond to our near abroad? Though lots of those NATO countries, we've already drawn the NATO line around them. How do you address Russian concerns without sort of pulling the rug out from under those people who you've already drawn the line around as part of your alliance?
Yeah, I think you've hit on the crux of the dilemma. I mean, we've actually made commitment. I mean, once a country makes a commitment, makes a public commitment, and it is engaged its national interest, it is also engaged its national reputation and honor. And pardon me, if it does roll those commitments back, I mean that's a significant thing, because you have made yourself look untrustworthy, weak, feckless. Allies and friends, and potential allies and friends all over the world might notice that. There's been a lot of talk since the pullout from Afghanistan last August, that the United States has lost face, lost its reputation as a trustworthy ally, and so forth. And so, I think that leaves us kind of in a pickle. I guess my advice to the administration, if they're listening, would be to try to take this private. Making it public makes it really hard to compromise. So I don't know if by doing the Teddy Roosevelt thing, speaking softly while carrying a big stick, that might be the way to do it. And so I think there could be value in looking back at how he and people like him, very circumspect politicians, handle things. Because I think just doing this in public and backing each other into a corner is probably not doing a lot of good. The one thing that's and just a side point, going back to what you said before, I think NATO, and you said it's very unlikely Ukraine will come into NATO. I think that's actually true, because there's fighting going on in eastern Ukraine, has been for years. If Ukraine were to sign on to NATO today, it could demand an Article 5 declaration requiring the allies to think about what should happen if an armed attack occurs on a NATO partner. So we might be picking war by admitting admitting Ukraine to the alliance today. So that's something that's out there as well. We're on record favoring it, but at the same time, I think that's I would just like to see the negotiations go very quiet.
Yeah, so I guess in that sense, given there's already been a number of pretty public, high profile meetings between the various diplomats from not just the U.S. and Russian sides, but also the European side, because they're that's their front door, backyard, whatever you want to call it. Do you think is it possible to even go back to sort of closed door discussions about this without raising further questions about what's being discussed behind those doors? Or is that something that should have happened much earlier? Or do you think there could still be genuine value in doing that and being able to come to a resolution that doesn't involve open warfare by going to closed doors?
Yeah, I think pardon me. I think you raised an excellent point, and I actually don't know. It's really hard once you get into one of these standoffs to actually do that. I would have liked to see the negotiations be very quiet and us work out something with Moscow on a private level. There's actually an interesting, it's sort of one of my stock anecdotes that when I talk about how to do negotiations, and it goes back to the era of Teddy Roosevelt. There was a potential infraction of the Monroe Doctrine in 1902 when another one of these circumstances happened, also in Venezuela. Kind of an interesting parallel today. It looked like Venezuela was not going to repay one of its European creditors. In fact, creditors in several European countries. The Europeans, particularly Great Britain and Imperial Germany, get together, assemble a naval squadron, and send that squadron to the Caribbean to blockade Venezuela. There's ultimately some gunfire between the fleet and the Venezuelan Navy and shore facilities. TR is very worried that an infraction of the Monroe Doctrine is going to happen. He goes quiet. He essentially sends Admiral Dewey, commanding basically the entire U.S. Atlantic Fleet, which was basically the entire U.S. Navy in that day, sends it to the Caribbean to shatter the European fleet, deter them from seizing territory in the Americas. But that's cool. I mean, he does this, but like I said, he goes quiet. he is so circumspect about relations with London and with Berlin that it takes a century, not until 2002, in an article in the Naval War College Review, is it actually proven that this deployment actually happened. So we think about the TRB and the guy with the big glasses and the bombast and a huge smile, but you know what? This was good. This was a guy who was capable of doing things in private. So he didn't put the Kaiser and the British Prime Minister on the spot and compel them to do something simply by threatening to discredit them in public. So, but yeah, once you get into it in public, it is kind of hard to ratchet down. So which is why I said I wish that we can do this. I don't know if we can.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of not great options out there.
Yeah, when you engage a foreign leader's or a foreign country's honor, boy, I tell you what, we talk about interest and all that kind of stuff, but in Thucydides terms, I mean, I think honor is probably the first of the major things that drives human behavior.
Great.
Yeah, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead, sir.
I was just curious on your thoughts, right, on during the previous President Obama's administration. John Kerry comes out and says, "Hey, we're basically not going to enforce the Monroe Doctrine." I think it was around November of 2013, which, subsequent, I think the day after that announcement, Russia sent some submarines over to Venezuela, and there's some lingering activities between Venezuela and Nicaragua that have been basically capitalized on by Russian capabilities there. So, in your thoughts, is this now turning to become a strategic implication for us? And I mean, what were the reasonings in your mind for doing that? And what kind of implications outside of the ones that we're considering here, or maybe some of the initial ones unfolding into something larger?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I probably should have brought up I never have understood why Kerry saw fit to bring up the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, it's something that we actually mentioned as a precedent in Washington. I just don't think it's very persuasive. I mean, and this is actually the value of this conversation, because we're now starting to branch off in a very productive direction. I mean, after the Monroe Doctrine goes away, more or less, the TR Corollary certainly goes away. The Monroe Doctrine, I think, more or less drops out of discourse in the mid-1920s. But what comes after it? That's when the inter-American system that we know today starts taking shape. I would contend you would never get anybody in Latin America or Canada or anywhere like that to agree to this, but I would say this was sort of a multilateral inter-American Monroe Doctrine, designed to keep hostile powers out of the New World, so that the nations here can develop, do all the things that are worthwhile for nations to do. So, which is why I thought it was counterproductive when Kerry did that, because he raised the prospect of a unilateral U.S. effort to keep others out of the hemisphere. When in fact it would probably be better to work through the Organization of American States and the other regional frameworks that we've had since the 1930s, since hemispheric defense became a thing under President Hoover, and then of course under President Franklin Roosevelt. So. So I think that Kerry, if he wanted to appeal to the Monroe Doctrine, he should have at least connected it to the inter-American system. We're all guardians of our own hemisphere today. The United States does not actually need to hold the hands of Brazil, serious powers like Brazil and Chile and so forth. And I think that would be the way to frame this. And that's a potential way that the United States could work through this problem today, is by working with our neighbors to the south. So maybe there's a fifth model right there that might actually be preferable to the other ones that I mentioned, that might describe our future trajectory vis-a-vis Russia. Yeah, great question. Loved it.
All right, I got one more question for you, and then if Lieutenant Colonel Zepeda doesn't have anything else, I'll kick it back to you for any closing comments. But I've been looking. Last couple of days, there's been some headlines, not about Russian forces heading down to the Caribbean, but this sort of new gray zone type competition going off, I think off the coast of Ireland, where they'd send some of their northern fleet to do live fire missile drills, which understandably gets the attention of the Irish government. But then in response, there have been some not United Kingdom military forces, but I think Irish fishermen putting themselves into that zone as a preventative measure for those exercises. Do you think that is is this something we might see more of? Not maybe where it's not a formal government responding, but you have some other non-state actors, if you will, affiliated with either European or American governments, sort of doing this lower level competition to try and push back. And do you think this is a new worrisome level of escalation doing, or could this be maybe I don't know if off ramp is the right word, but a lower level of each side sort of thumping its chest, if you will, without actually turning into something more kinetic? I don't know. I hope that question made sense.
Yeah, I was trying not to smirk at you while you were talking. I actually hadn't heard it. I had heard about the Russian drills off the Irish coast. I had not heard about Irish fishermen getting in the way. But that's my God rest her soul. My mother-in-law was Irish, and I could actually see her putting out to sea and doing that kind of thing. This is a very sort of ornery people, and in a lot of ways. I think that's a fantastic story. Thanks for a writing idea. I think I'll have to check on that for this week. But yeah. Well, there could be a precedent in the South China Sea, potentially in the Black Sea, Baltic. Pick your favorite peripheral sea for fishermen to actually do this. So maybe we're looking at the Irish Maritime Militia taking shape, much as the PLA or much as Beijing operates a maritime militia in the South China Sea. I think there's a real prospect of that. I mean, it's whether these people are operating at the behest of the government, I guess, is a question. I sort of doubt it. So it almost reminds me of the Cajun Navy that we see when we have natural disasters. Sort of a spontaneous fleet of private craft come into being to go to New Orleans or whoever suffered a hurricane. On September 11th in New York Harbor to evacuate people from Lower Manhattan. I certainly think that's worth studying, and in fact, I intend to study that myself. You raise a theoretical, well, not a theoretical point, but a legal point. These exercises, and you have to think this is deliberate. These exercises are happening not within the Irish territorial sea, obviously, which is within 12 miles of the Irish coast, but they are happening within the exclusive economic zone. They are not illegal in any sense. They're not. The Russians are not harvesting Irish resources or anything. But at the same time, you do have to think that's a poke in the eye of Europe, out in the Atlantic Ocean. So, but yeah, I think that I know you all down at the Marine Corps University are very into studying gray zone operations, and I think this is something that's worth inquiring into. But I don't know.
Yeah, to be clear, I was not. I personally, I don't think this is being, either at the behest of the Irish or the UK government. But I thought it was an interesting thing to look at because we talk a lot about these things below the threshold of our armed conflict, and it's always our competitors doing it to us. Well, what if we did it to them, right? Like flip the script and see how they would respond. And I don't know, but maybe that's that we could create some new opportunities for ourselves to keep competition below something.
Yeah, absolutely. We as you well know, we've been doing some gaming on this over the last couple of years with Art Corbett before his untimely demise, and then afterwards. But yeah, we are. I think the outcome of the game, or at least my big takeaway from the game last July, I think it was that we need to add rungs to our escalation ladder. China has a lot of rungs. China and Russia have lots of rungs on their escalation ladder, whereas we basically have 3: do nothing, shoot, or nuke them. And that's really not a very palatable menu of options. So anything we can do to try to give ourselves options so that we can do something short of taking one of those unpalatable options is something that we ought to be exploring.
Yeah, certainly, especially if we think that this is going to be sort of the trend of the future, more.
Yeah, it is
aggressive competition.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the way. In fact, if I were advising people in Moscow or Beijing, I probably would have advised them to do this sort of thing. Certainly, as long as they think the United States is still the superior competitor, this gives them options to accomplish their geopolitical goals, provided they're patient and willing to do it incrementally. They can still progress towards those goals. But yeah, like you said, if we can help Ukraine or the Philippines or Vietnam or whoever, flip the script on the red teams. I think that's all to the good. I actually think you're starting to see that happen in the South China Sea, which is what I spend most of my time on. Indonesia is starting to notice that China has claims in its backyard. My email inbox reveals that Vietnam is very worried and very interested in encountering China. I hear from people in Vietnam most days, which is kind of shocking to me because I don't study Vietnam. But again, this is, I mean, I actually think you're starting to see a turn back against gray zone operations. Maybe there'll be some sort of balance of power that will prevail there that will deter the bad guys from doing what they're trying to do now.
Yeah, I guess we'll see. Tank Hurdles of Sir, do you have any other questions?
Very informative. I got a degree in international relations, and I've done some digging on this very topic. So it's very interesting to see how some of these things kind of circle back around and still are relevant in today's operating environment. Certainly a factor with all things considered, especially with the Ukraine issue and everything else. So I'm just very curious to see how things all kind of unfold. And at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of factors, and this is just one of them that happens to impact us a little bit more directly and closer to the homeland here. So great topic. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we're very fond of the old joke from Mark Twain: "History never repeats itself, but it often rhymes." And I think that's what we're seeing, which is why we see value in studying history, because of those rhymes. So there are always differences from the past, but actually bouncing current events against the past and seeing the differences, I think, is actually as instructive as finding the parallels. So thank you for your time and effort again.
Yeah. Again, thank you, Dr. Holmes, for joining us for a third time, and especially on short notice, since you're kind of building this special project as it's flying along. So to our audience who's listened to this, thanks for your time. And again, we're going to be having a number of special episodes and other content coming out on our various channels and on our website. So we'll be promoting those, but certainly stay tuned for updates, because we're trying to collect a good amount of content, commentary, and insight on this topic, which is developed very rapidly, and we don't really know where it's going to end. So, Dr. Holmes, again, thank you for your insights and joining us today.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.